Sheila McGregor will speak for about 35 minutes. She's a long-standing member of the SWP. She's from Tower Hamlets, and she's the convener of Stop to Racism in Tower Hamlets as well. So over to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Maxine. Just so that everybody is totally aware, I didn't put together a PowerPoint, so you've got one slide instead of a whole load of others, but it makes a point which I'll come back to later. Now, what I want to cover in this discussion today are really basically three areas. Firstly, the background to the emergence of social reproduction theory, what is meant by social reproduction theory, and the consequences, the trajectory of social reproduction theory. Now, the development of ideas always has to be contextualised because they always come from somewhere under particular influences. And so the first one, I think, which is important to say, is that social reproduction theory has emerged in the context of 20 years, I'm talking about the West, the United States and Europe and so forth, of social movements with a relatively low level of class struggle. Now, there are exceptions to that, where there have been Greece and France and so forth, where at times there have been higher levels of class struggle. But generally, that is the background, and particularly for Canada and the United States, which is where these the current social reproduction theory has emerged from. So that's, and as Titi Bhattacharya herself put it in Berlin in 2018, the sudden eruption of interest is rooted in the particular conjuncture with struggles away from the workplace in the global north. Now, the other thing I should actually say is that this emerges as a set of ideas really within quite a narrow field, a narrow layer of people, a kind of revolutionary milieu, if you like. That is how these ideas have emerged recently. And so I think the other thing which is important to link the emergence of these ideas to is to the debate about the nature of revolutionary organisation. I don't think it is accidental that one of the key drivers of this is David McNally and his partner Susan Ferguson, who, when David McNally's ideas about the need to move away from micro-party building. I mean, he said in 2009, after the crash, it is indeed a new era, which is true. After the banking crash, I think we all had a stock take. I mean, for example, in this country, we had a stock take about whether we continued with the centrality of the Stop the War movement, or whether we actually had to shift to looking at the question of economic issues and austerity and so forth. He then goes on to say, and the left we need to build needs to be something qualitatively different from the left that existed prior to it. And he then goes on to say, we need to imagine processes of fusion and regroupment out of genuine radicalisation. There's a need for shifts and realignments on the left internationally. And he then goes on to talk about the need to break out of sectarianism, and he particularly locates the problem of sectarianism with the International Socialist tradition. Now, of course, as people discussed in John Molyneux's meeting yesterday, there's always the Scylla and Charybdis in building revolutionary organisation, of avoiding the pressure, of not falling into the pressures of different kinds of reformism, which is the Scylla on the one hand, and the other of not falling into sectarianism by being completely isolated, that necessarily, as Duncan Hallis would have put it, if you are engaged in the movements, you are attempting to influence the movements and win people to revolutionary politics, but they are also influencing you, because you cannot have a dialogue and a debate with people and influence them if you don't listen to them. And in the process of listening and responding, you are bound to be influenced. That goes without saying. So there is always this Scylla and Charybdis, but but then what then became, if you remember, I mean, I remember it very, very popular at the time, and there was all sorts of arguments which touched us and touched other people internationally, was actually we had to move to a model like Syriza. And as people have pointed out, Syriza, the arguments that we were putting at the time, that you cannot change society from the top through the state, that concept of taking control over the state with a social movement from below actually was doomed to crash on the rocks. It was a form of reformism. That argument tragically has been borne out by the events with both Podemos and Syriza. But I think we actually have to contextualise the social reproduction theory is being born out of that notion of reconceptualising what kind of revolutionary organisation we need to build. Now, the next other important shaping of the emergence of social reproduction theory is the question of intersectionality. And I know a number of years ago it was very in to say I am intersectional or I am nothing, and so quite rightly. And if you're interested, if you Google, probably otherwise I could send it to you, Marxist feminists on on intersectionality, there's a very interesting discussion by people like Hester Rubinstein and Lisa Vogel and Martha Jimenez, precisely on the limitations and problems with intersectionality. But that intersectionality had emerged out of the defeat of the revolutionary movements in the 1960s and 70s, and also out of an argument by black feminists that the problem with the white feminist movement was that it had always ignored the needs of black feminists, and it had led to a conception of oppression where you lay out all the different oppressions. They do intersect, and class was one of them. And I think as Martha Jimenez says it extremely sharply. She says, from the point of view of Marxist theory, intersectionality is a powerful ideology that obscures the meaning and significance of class and class relations. And I think she's absolutely right about that. And so one of the things which is very positive about the development of social reproduction theory is about overcoming the limitations of intersectionality. But one of the things that intersectionality did, amongst others, apart from being a kind of description of oppressions as opposed to analysis of the roots of oppression and the relationship to exploitation and so forth, is that, as Jimenez says, it flattens the concept of class in several important ways. If you slot class into a series of oppressions, then class actually becomes the white male working class, because every other form of oppression, being a woman, being black, being disabled, is actually in another category. So class therefore becomes white and male. That's the first important thing. And the second thing, which is actually, I think, quite important about it, is it's just about class. Well, actually, as revolutionary socialists, what we talk about is a confrontation of class, because there are two major contending classes inside society, and those two major contending classes, at the heart of exploitation, that leads to class struggle. And if you simply talk about class, and we can all talk about class, so what? The key question for us is actually the question of class struggle and the central role of the working class in change. So, right, so the as I say, the important thing is, and again, Jimenez says it, that one of the things that we actually have to do in relation to intersectionality is to reassert the complexity of Marxist ideas about exploitation and oppression, and show how exploitation gives rise to and shapes different kinds of oppression. And I think she's absolutely right about that. And therefore the question is really whether social reproduction theory, as it has emerged, fulfills those sorts of ideas. And I mean, now, okay, right. So the origins of the expression social reproduction actually go back to the 70s and the 80s. In that period, when Marxists were grappling with how to explain the women's oppression and how it worked under capitalism, the international socialist tradition used the expression the privatised reproduction of labour power in order to locate the roots of women's oppression under capitalism. And there's a reason for that, because Marx talked about social reproduction, and by which he meant the reproduction of the totality of society. And the danger is if you use the concept of social reproduction, which was used by people like Vogel and by people like Joanna Brenner and Maria Ramas and so forth in the United States, is that you begin to conflate in people's minds the Marxist concept of the totality of reproduction of society, starting from, you know, the mode of production and so on and so forth. You begin to conflate that with the particularity of explaining the question of women's oppression. So I actually always thought that the concept, the privatised reproduction of labour power, captured that much more accurately. But nevertheless, the analyses, if you look at them, of Chris Harman, Lindsay German, you know, how it's been continued by Judith Orr, myself and other people, Maria Ramas, Joanna Brenner and Vogel and so on and so forth, there is clearly an overlap about locating the question of women's oppression inside capitalism. So, and explaining how the working class family has been fashioned to fit the needs of the capitalist class and accumulation, and the importance also of understanding how the balance between the drive to exploit and women bearing the brunt of the reproduction of the working class inside the family, how the balance between the extent of exploitation of women workers and the carrying of the oppression through the family, how that changes historically over time. Now, one of the things that if you look at the social reproduction theorists, McNally and Ferguson, were instrumental in the the republication of Lisa Vogel's book, Marxism and the Oppression of Women. And I often wondered why they focused in particular on Lisa Vogel's book as opposed to all the other writings that there are about the oppression of women. And it seems to me, well, firstly, she has a particularly sharp formulation of the contradiction between exploitation and oppression, which of the position of women workers inside capitalist society. So from the point of view of capital, the capital wants to maximise the extraction of surplus value across the working class, which means pulling women into the workforce. On the other hand, wants the working class family to bear the brunt of the reproduction of the working class, and therefore women to bear that role as well. And therefore there is a conflict both for women, which we've always classified as a double burden, and also a contradiction from the point of view of the capitalist class in terms of delivering that. And she has a particularly sharp formulation in her book about that, which corresponds actually to the historical explanations given by people like Brenner and Ramas and Harman about the way in which the exploitation and oppression of women has changed according to the needs of capital. That is, you know, historically analysed along the filling out that sort of the analysis of that contradiction. Now. And it also comes, the same contradiction applies when you actually look at the way in which the state has taken on a whole series of aspects of the reproduction of the working class. If you think out of the Second World War, with the mushrooming of the health service, social care, and education, although education I think is slightly different, because that's about producing a skilled working class that fits the needs of capital, that actually also capital faces a contradiction about how much do you lay out in terms of paying for those services, and how much do you maintain as part of profits from the system. Anne Rogers actually, again, gives an extremely good analysis of exactly that contradictory position of capital in relation to the social reproduction of the working class through the state, which you can find in ISJ 59. But the problem is, and this is really one of the things that I want to talk about briefly, is that one of the consequences of people like of Titi Bhattacharya and et al. All focusing on Lisa Vogel, and every single lecture you go to, certainly that I have been to, it always starts with Lisa Vogel and the importance of her analysis of women's oppression, as if nothing else had ever been written about women's oppression ever by anybody. And, you know, we've actually had to wait for the Lisa Vogel. Now, I'm not averse to recognising the clarity with which she puts that contradiction I talked about. Absolutely right. The only problem is she wrote an entire book. And the book is of a couple of 100 pages long. And the particular formulation comes in chapter 10 or chapter 11. So it's not like a box of chocolates. You know, when you get your black magic, your box of black magic, it has in the front lid, it usually has a little menu, and if you want the orange one, which I always do, then you can find your orange black magic chocolate, and you can pick and choose what you want. Well, actually, a book is not like that. You know, you start from page 1 and you go to the end, and in the process of reading the whole of Lisa Vogel's book, you actually have to go through a demolition of what I would call is the revolutionary tradition. Firstly, you actually have to go through the inadequacies of Marx. And actually, in terms of developing the analysis of women's oppression under capitalism, I think everybody has always said Engels provided an analysis of the roots of women's oppression, which we could build on, but Marx actually said remarkably little. Everybody has always said that, but then gone on to say, but actually, how can we use his approach in order to develop an analysis? But you go through the inadequacies of Marx, then you go through the fact that Engels is completely wrong. Not only that, he is really responsible for the dual systems of analysis developed by socialist feminists in the 1970s, who talked about we need to fight capitalism and exploitation, but we also need to fight women's oppression, and therefore we need to fight patriarchy. There are two systems, one of exploitation, one of oppression. There the twain shall meet, and we actually have to fight both, which also fitted people who thought that socialist societies were, China and Cuba were socialist societies, and women's oppression continued, and therefore, they might have got rid of capitalism, but they hadn't got rid of women's oppression. So it all fitted that. So you have to go through all of that, and then you have to go through the inadequacies of the revolutionary movement. Lenin gets a positive mention. Until you then come to the core of this placing of the analysis of women's oppression, which is also rooted in an argument which, because once you reject Engels and the heart of Engels, and there are limitations to Engels which we can discuss, but the heart of Engels is to look at the way in which the changes in the way human beings interacted with nature to produce their living and their way of life, the way in which those changes led to the subordination of women because of the relationship between men and the production of surplus as society changed and class society emerged, and that led therefore to the downfall of women. Now that is actually crucial because it actually says there is an element of the fact of the biological reproductive capacity of women to have children, which men don't have, might change, but currently don't for millions of people on the planet. And therefore that is a material fact of life, but it is the interaction between that and the changes in the forces of production which actually leads to the downfall, the oppression of women and the downfall of women. It is not solely located in the fact that women have wombs and can have children, and that is absolutely absolutely crucial, and always has been, certainly for me as a revolutionary socialist, to my concept of the question of the liberation of women, that I am not a prisoner of my biology, thank you very much, and I'm not going to have a Marxist telling me that I am a prisoner of my biology. So that is one of the, I think, very weaknesses which has actually been accepted by people who accept social reproduction theory, which I find actually quite extraordinary. So that is one of the a couple of the problems. The other two things I'd just like to mention. I actually think that the revolutionary socialist tradition in relation to women is enormously rich. It is it's not perfect, but it's enormously rich because it comes out of the debates and experiences of the revolutionary movement, tackling all sorts of aspects of women's oppression. Where do we turn to when we look at the question of how to relate to Muslim women? Actually, we go back to the Third International, and actually the work that they did in the East with the Congress of the East. It is a starting point, because actually that was an experience that we'll pull in. When we talk about sexuality, who is the first people that actually people go to? It's a question. It's Alexander Kollontai, who is one of the people in terms of fighting for women's liberation who put it on the map. Clara Zetkin. There are a whole range of people, none of whom may be perfect, but actually are part. And that I've only mentioned a few. There's all. I could talk about Harriet Tubman. There's all the leadership in terms of the fight against slavery. There is a wealth of tradition which you need to pull on, which you need to consider as part of our tradition in terms of developing our understanding of women's oppression and how to fight it. Now, so there are weaknesses, I think, and the reason that I think it's important to go through that is that if you are new to revolutionary politics or new to moving into struggle and are looking for explanations and analyses of women's oppression and how to move forward, is Lisa Vogel's book the book that you give to people? Well, the problem with that is you'd actually have to give it with a health warning. You'd actually have to say, please don't believe what she writes about Engels. Please don't believe what she writes about the revolutionary tradition. Please don't believe her conclusion, which is that we need cross-class movements in order to liberate women. Please don't believe all those things. There are useful things. Well, you don't do that with people. When people are actually coming into politics and developing their ideas, actually you want to give people clear explanations of things on which they can then build. So I would actually put it this way round. Can we develop analyses of the complexity of women's oppression and how it works its way through, right through to the Me Too movement, without Lisa Vogel? Yes. If you just base yourself on Lisa Vogel, can you do the same? I don't think you can. And that's that's my belief. She has useful things to say, but not in terms of really explaining the question of women's oppression. But that's. I now want to go on to the third aspect, which is what is the direction of travel. And I think that's very important. It's interesting. I went to a seminar in Brighton for my pains, done by a woman, a graduate, I think from Canada actually, called Christine Munro, because she was talking about social reproduction theory, and I don't actually agree with her analysis, but she was much sharper than I was. She simply launched straight into Titi Bhattacharya, and she simply said, there's a blurring of the primacy of the sphere of production and centrality of drive to accumulate. And she says the real danger of Titi Bhattacharya's is that her emphasis on labour done by women in the family outside the workplace removes it from the understanding that exploitation and domination shape what happens in the household and creates the danger that work in the household will be conflated with value-producing labour through exploitation. And as she then goes on to say, there is no social reproduction without societal reproduction, as all production and reproduction in capitalist society are indelibly shaped by accumulation. And she's absolutely, I think she's absolutely right about that. As I say, I think the way she goes on to develop her analysis is not a way that I would agree with it. But that running together, which you find in T.C. Bhattacharya, and is not in Vogel actually, it's a development from Vogel. It's not something that you can throw at Vogel, but it's certainly a development since, is the conflation of reproduction and production. They are not equal spheres. To put it simply, what we live in, whether a cave or a house or a tent or on the street, what you eat, what you wear, whether you clean your teeth, how you clean your teeth, how you have sexual relations, who you have sexual relationships, in the end of the day is shaped and driven by the kind of society you live in, and under capitalism is driven by capitalism. The commodification of our lives is almost total. You know, with the invasion of absolutely every layer of our lives, including, one of the things that the women's movement did was actually talk about the way sexual relations were commodified and alienated under capitalism. Every aspect driven by the fact, as Marx and Engels pointed out in the Communist Manifesto, capitalism commodifies the totality of what happens on the on the planet. And so we actually have to get the relationship between the two spheres correct if we're going to have a correct understanding of the nature of women's oppression. The second thing is that the presentation, what T.C. Bhattacharya at one level is very good at ramming home, I shouldn't put ramming home, is actually stating very forcefully that the working class is mixed, both colour-wise, gender-wise, different kinds of occupations, and so on and so forth. Couldn't disagree at all, except at the edges there is a blurring between people who are actually being exploited and in work and who aren't. Now, in a big sense, we include everybody in the working class movement, whether they happen to be directly in work or whether they're not, whether they're working part-time or whether they're not, whether they're in precarious work or whether they're not. But however, we do stress the central importance of the collective, which is created as a consequence of exploitation. That collective is at the centre of the potential power of workers in a way that it is not as atomised individuals outside the workplace. That is not to say that social movements which develop on the street are not crucially important. We know that. They always have been, whether it is housing campaigns, whether it is water campaigns, whether it is land campaigns, whether it's the campaigns against racism, whether it's currently the climate action and so forth. All of those campaigns are centrally important. But we are also clear that with the question of power, some of those campaigns can win at the level of the street. The abortion campaign in Ireland, for lots of complex reasons, were able to win without it developing into strike action. The same has been true of the Anti-Nazi League. It wasn't true of the Stop the War movement, which put the biggest number of people on the streets at that stage. It wasn't true because the centrality of the imperialist drive to war was such it would have actually taken widespread strike action by workers in order to stop that drive to war. And it's having an understanding of what you are fighting over and what the necessary forces are, which is crucial to the argument about the centrality of the working class, which means that for us, or really for me, the concept of the women's strike is both positive and negative, and this is one of the things which runs through all of this, is it is absolutely positive to say on International Women's Day we want women to strike. Of course we do. However, as a revolutionary socialist, I want all workers to strike, because I want men to understand that it is their fight too to fight for women's liberation, and therefore you want to close down workplaces. You actually want to hit the system at its heart. You do not, if you can't do that, then of course let's go for the demonstration in work's time, and some people will book time off work, but you don't actually, but you're clear about your target, that you want to hit capital over the question of women's liberation, and maybe have specific sets of demands over it. You don't simply want to say, well, I'm not going to do the cooking for the day, or I'm not going to feed the kids. Well, that's wonderful, isn't it? Well, hopefully somebody else is around who can do. So it is double-edged, and there is, and that double-edged thing about it is I think a central weakness, because it's not confronting the question of where the power lies inside society, and it is not confronting the question that actually we think that women's liberation is in the interest of men as well, and they actually have to do that. Right, I'm just going to mention quickly two other things, and that is there's a whole number of other analyses which are emerging around racism and around migrant workers and climate change and so on and so forth, from the point of social reproduction, i.e. from the way in which the working class is reproduced. At one level, I have absolutely nothing against the working through of the impact of the reproduction of the working class in relation to migrant labour, in relation to climate change, in relation to all those things. However, that is not the starting point that I have as a revolutionary socialist, because as for me, the starting point actually has to be revolutionary theory is about revolutionary practice. It is about a guide to our practice, and therefore how we develop our theory is shaped by our involvement in working class struggle, the issues which are thrown up, what we have to analyse, what we actually have to understand, and what we actually put forward as a solution. I'll give you a couple of examples. Why is it we had a meeting this year on unconscious bias in the course on racism? I mean, why? We didn't last year. We might not have last year. The reason is that because all of a sudden, in the argument about institutional racism and dealing with institutional racism has begun to morph into the idea that individuals are responsible for racism in society because of the unconscious bias that they have in their heads. And therefore, we have to address this question. We actually have to say what is good about this analysis, but what are its weaknesses, and how do actually we concretely, as revolutionaries, deal with it in the unions and the workplaces where this issue is coming up. I'll give another question. Understanding about what happens to migrant women workers is very, very important, and how they are used and abused as domestic workers is crucial. But when it comes to the central question of migrant labour at the moment, what are the central arguments that we face in North America and over here? It's the wall in Mexico between the United States and Trump's attitude to that wall and keeping out migrants, and what happened recently with the drowning of the two in the river. It's the Mediterranean being a place for a death trap for migrants, and opening the borders and allowing migrants in. That central question of how you look at the question of migration is driven from the fact that we understand that actually racism is a tool, which Marx actually argued through in relation to Irish workers, is a tool of the ruling class to divide us one against the other, and we as revolutionaries in the process of winning an argument to unify the working class and the international nature of the working class have to counter the specific forms of racism as they emerge in society, to be shaped by the polemic and the debate what we are involved in, because we are intervening inside society. I'll stop there.
Hi, Hi, thank you very much for opening the discussion. It was a very broad analysis. I've been following it a little bit, so I still got a lot of reading up to do. I thought it was interesting what you mentioned about the position of revolutionary socialists. But from my perspective, I'm actually quite happy with the debates around intersectionality and around social reproduction and women's strike, because I see a lot of young people getting active again around these issues, and it really gives me hope with regarding to the far right and everything. And it's also for me, so for the women's strike, yes, I agree from a socialist perspective, we want all the workers to strike, and we want the workers to see that the specific oppression of women and marginalized groups divides us and prevents us from striking back in a good way. On the other hand, I see the development of the women's strike in Spain, and I think it has a lot of potential. I mean, I think in 2018 they had a short strike of 8 hours. Already this year they've driven it up to 24 hours. You say, what does it matter if a woman doesn't clean? But they actually said, look, we're not taking care of the children as well. So men were obliged to take off from work, set up crashes and stuff, especially for this day. So it does have impact. And for me, it's always a question, what is the starting point of an action? I mean, I remember Rosa Luxemburg saying, mass strikes and workers' action on the work floor, socio-economically, and political actions like demonstrations feed into each other. So I think it's not simply saying, of course we want it to get bigger, but we also, I think, have to take this as a starting point and building up on certain things. So I missed that in this story. For me, it's a starting point. And I think also we have to take some criticism regarding Marx and Engels and the position of socialists, because I was at the, for instance, at the match strike meeting about the match women, and I was impressed that actually they started this strike, and the Dockers were inspired by them, and that was never acknowledged in history. It took a female historian to dig up that history and actually draw our attention to it. And I think socialist parties, sorry, I'll sum up, but socialist parties has done it in the past too, where they don't acknowledge the role of women and marginalized groups. The Dutch socialists do it again. The Dutch Socialist Party, the leader of that, says that Trump is refreshing, while these women's movements are taking up. So I think we have to also take that into account and build on Marx and Engels and take some criticism, because they didn't know all of the things. They were in the Victorian age, and they also had their own limited ideas about women, unfortunately, as all did in that time.
Second row from the back.
Yeah, I wanted to really talk about how the needs of capital have shaped women's oppression really since the publication of Lisa Vogel back in the day, because I think the lives of women and the responsibilities that women have in terms of the reproduction of labour and care in the family has massively increased, actually. I mean, I'm a retired teacher. I can remember back in the day when I first had my child at the age of 28 years ago, every single woman in my staff room at my school who had a child returned to work full time. Now that does not happen. Every woman that has a child at school actually takes up part-time work, because the state has given us, because of neoliberal policies, we have now more responsibility. Families have more responsibilities. Schools put enormous pressure on families to take responsibility for all sorts of things, like homework, like exam results, in a way that they didn't back 30 years ago. You look at older women. Older women now, often of my age, go part-time towards the end of their working lives because they've got the responsibility of looking after elderly parents and grandchildren. Now that is capitalism reshaping the oppression of women, I think, as primary carers. But also, I think it's important to understand that families take that responsibility. It's predominantly women, but also men often have to take. Women work shifts with men to care for grandchildren, shifts with their partners to care for older people. And to be honest, we are going to come to a real crisis about this in Britain, and I think I talked to a Canadian comrade, in Canada, because the adult social care services are on the point of collapse, total, utter collapse. Now, I think the question there is, how do we say, what will the protests look like that could really change that or defend that? And I think you have to look to the example of the Birmingham care workers, you have to look to the Glasgow women, where really they were able and got male solidarity from dustmen and others in the workplace, because it will be impossible, I think, for us to do that as individual carers looking after somebody who's disabled in your home. I hope there is a women's strike, but, you know, I hope there is a family strike to stop allowing neoliberal policies to ruin our private lives and our family lives. But actually, I really believe it will be in the workplace where the real power lies to overturn those neoliberal policies, which are making family life for many, many people an utter and total misery and oppressive.
Thank you. First point, just very briefly in response to the first question, is of course we're all a product of our time, but Marx was not a stuffy, patriarchal Victorian father who didn't relate to the female struggles of the time. Even within his own family, Eleanor Marx, at the age of 16, went through France when it was in the midst of the Paris Commune. His daughters were all very involved in politics with his support. He related and spoke very positively about the role of the women in the Paris Commune and appreciated women's struggles. And when the first woman got elected to the board of the First International, he changed his address from fellows to comrades and brothers and sisters, so that his language took account of the fact that women were now involved in that. I firstly just wanted to say thank you to Sheila for the work she's been doing on social reproduction theory. But I disagree with some of it, and so I want to say the nice bit first, Sheila. The context, I think, for social reproduction theory is the dominance of patriarchy theory from the 1980s, really, and the idea, crudely put, that there's two separate struggles, that Marxism might be quite useful to deal with exploitation, but really men, sexism, violence, the oppression of women requires a separate struggle, and you cannot reduce that to the social organisation of society. Social reproduction theory, which I think is based on Marx rather than Vogel actually, is an attempt to reassert Marx and Marxism as a theory with the capacity to explain women's oppression and to point to a way of ending it. By looking at the system as a unitary system, the driver is, of course, accumulation, but everybody's lives are shaped by that, everybody has a role in overthrowing that. Sheila says we must get the relationship between the sphere of production and reproduction right, but Jan has just very articulately explained how the commodification of the labour of the family is changing that. You know, I am not the only working mum who relies on Just Eats. Most of us pay for childcare, pay for people to bring our food to our door, pay for all kinds of services that the state should be providing, but is not. And our lives are becoming more and more commodified as we're forced to work longer and longer hours. And therefore that relationship in the working class and what the working class looks like is changing. And that's not something we should be defensive about or find complicated. And a lot of the people who promote social reproduction theory are very keen on the strikes in America because they're led by women, just as I'm sure members of the Socialist Workers' Party are. The final thing, which I find irritating about social reproduction theorists, is that they say, you know, this means that we can't just focus on class struggle at the point of production, as if we ever had. And even communist parties always took the question of racism and the Scots Boys and rent strikes and all these other things seriously, and so do we. And community struggles and women's struggles and struggles against racism all feed into and are not contradictory to the combativity of a working class which is female, which is multinational, which is different coloured and so on. So I think the power of Marxism is very strong, and our moment is coming where we can now find groups of excited young people at a conference about social reproduction TT addressed recently, talking about use values and labour power and where the family fits in, and that's great. I think you know the Socialist Workers' Party should be welcoming that, because you've got the tools to intervene very effectively in that struggle and those debates.
Sorry. Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Sheila, for this very inspiring speech. I want to start with this point that Sheila made about this chapter 10, because if you read this unitary theory book by Vogel, it is composed of 11 chapters, and many people argue that forget about the rest. There are two insights. I'd say two insights don't make a theory, but this is exactly what is already in the term social reproduction theory. So there's something more behind this. There's one astonishing thing if you read the book. It is a tough book to read because it's very dry, very academic. And then there comes the point where Lisa Vogel argues saying, my theory doesn't explain women's oppression. You can't derive strategies from this. You can't derive a program from this. Not at all. So you say, this is strange. What is their enterprise actually? She says, my only enterprise is to set a theoretical framework that would transform Marxism. I mean, that's what she said later on. We didn't dare to say it in 1983, but in 1996 she said, when I wrote my book, it was all about the transformation of Marxism in general. And so for her, inside her book, she wouldn't, labor force, for example, is always a concept. The word concept appears time and again. It's all about concept. It's very idealist in a way. And she follows Althusser in her approach by detaching practice from theory, or the other way around, theory that is not tested by practice at all. So, for example, if you read her book, you never know what time is she actually talking about. Is it Victorian capitalism? Is it capitalism of today? Which country are you talking about? So Sheila mentioned that the experience of women's oppression is very diverse in a way. It's not like capitalist exploitation is more or less the same it was 150 years ago. You can't have capitalism without exploitation. But the level of oppression can be much sharper or less sharp. And it is much sharper in Saudi Arabia than it is here. So it is this, what Sheila says, this conflation between production and reproduction is the actual concept that she is following. She tries to say you can derive everything from Marx's work of capital, from exploitation. And saying because Engels had 30 or 40 pages on the family inside his work, this makes him already the father of this dual theory that later became the patriarchy theory. So she says more or less you can derive everything from Marx's theory, and out of this theory derives all the others. And I don't think this is right. And the second thing is that with Althusser she puts productive forces and relations of production vice versa. Althusser says the development of productive forces is not the first, but the other way around. So this leads to a situation where all the developments inside capitalism, with the state, with technological progress that changes so much our lives, is derided as technological determinism. Yeah, and so I think it's a very ahistoric work that you can't get anything out of this in terms of understanding how women's oppression actually changes over 150 years. And so therefore I think, yes, there are some insights that has to be taken serious, but two insights doesn't make a theory.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I can follow on from this contribution, because I'm also from Germany, and reading the book is, Lisa Vogel comes to a conclusion that also others have come, as Sheila said, Harman and others, that there is a growing need for capital to draw women inside the workforce, and there's also the problem of the reproduction of the labor force. But she comes from with a very different method than Harman, very different. Her method is not historical materialism; it's materialism without the historical part of it. And she says it very clearly. She attacks very fiercely the German ideology of Marx and Engels, and that's why I doubt that a social reproduction theory comes from Marx. There is a Marxist view on the reproduction, but social reproduction theory, I would have my doubts of it, because she said, let's cut off the Communist Manifesto, the German ideology, and the whole view of Marx and Engels, how history has been made by humans. In her book, there is no human action. There is no class struggle. The class struggle is always there, but it's abstract. It's completely abstract, and that's why this is my hope, my problem with it, a basic problem. But I have a question. Could you go on this contradiction of reproduction and production? You say that this is an insight she's giving us, and there's other contradictions, of course, in welfare state. I mean, there's even the contradiction in capitalist society that the capitalist has to pay a wage. He wants it the lowest possible, but it's not possible for him not to pay a wage, because then the labor cannot reproduce itself. This is only possible if there's plenty of workers coming from everywhere, and you don't know, you need skilled workers and so on. So it's you have to be very concrete on this and have a historical materialist analysis of how these contradictions evolve. And what follows from this contradiction? This would be my question. What follows? Because for her, it's only the look from the capitalist problem. But I think they solve it. They solve this contradiction for them. They put the double burden on them. And if there are skilled women workers, they find ways for them to work and to have children at the same time with kindergartens and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a contradiction for skilled women workers that should also have children in their mind, also mainly white women, basically. But I mean, this contradiction from the ruling class can be solved from our point of view. We really have to go against the double burden, the whole system of exploitation and oppression.
I think we have to take extraordinarily seriously the point that Judy Cox made earlier in the discussion. You see, Lisa Vogel's book is not the book I would give to someone who wants to know about women's oppression. Nonetheless, huge numbers of young women are reading Lisa Vogel's work and the work of social reproduction theory. And therefore it's completely sterile and abstract for us to start from a perspective of are we for or against social reproduction theory. What we have to do, though, is we have to critically engage with the debates around social reproduction theory. And here we have something very, very important to say. And you see, I mean, I've read Lisa Vogel's book. I think it has some extraordinary strengths. You see, the subtitle is a unified theory. This is important. She wants to systematically subordinate the reproduction to the process of accumulation under capital, and I agree with Lisa Vogel about that. Secondly, very importantly, she premises her work on a rejection of the domestic labour debate. She doesn't believe that domestic labour produces value. That's been a very difficult argument for us, and I'm quite happy that someone else is saying this, who lots of people are reading, who at least claims to come from a Marxist kind of trajectory. Thirdly, I think the contradiction she identifies, and she's not alone in identifying this, it's exactly the same contradiction, by the way, that Chris Harman identifies in some of his writings from the period, between the imperatives of reproduction and production within capitalism is correct. Now, it's a very abstract account, but if you think about the kind of crisis in social care that Jan talked about, if you think about the problems around welfare and so on, in some ways they're a manifestation of this problem. Think about the way in which women workers have been integrated into the workforce in Britain, largely for an expansion of part-time work. It reflects these contradictions. Same time, there are huge weaknesses in Lisa Vogel, and we shouldn't be scared of saying this. the absence of historicisation, both of the origins of women's oppression and the development, is really important for us to state. But it's also true, and Sheila convinced me about this, that sometimes it's overly biological in its discussion of women's oppression. So yes, there are weaknesses as well. Now, nonetheless, I think if you look at later social reproduction theory, in many ways it's far, far weaker than Lisa Vogel's own work. And in some senses, I'm quite keen to use Lisa Vogel against some of the Vogelists, if I can put it in those terms. Let me explain two areas where I think this is important. You see, the first is that the contemporary social reproduction theory, I think, to a large extent, reflects a 30, 40-year retreat from class. The centrality of production. And if you read this in Titi Bhattacharya, and here I think I disagree with Judy Cox, if you read Titi Bhattacharya, she's reliant on an account from someone called Michael Lebovitz, who wants to say that parallel to the circuit of capital is a circuit of labour power, in which you can treat labour power almost as if it's a form of capital put forward by workers that circulates through the system. I think this is a complete misreading of how capitalism actually functions. And it actually pulls away from this central insight in Vogel of subordinating the reproductive imperatives to accumulation. And it pulls away from the centrality of the point of production. Now, this isn't restricted to social reproduction theory. The most prominent Marxist in the world today probably is David Harvey. And he makes an almost identical argument about the parallel between production and circulation. This, I think, we have to reject. The second thing I think we have to challenge in social reproduction theory in its contemporary form is the idea that this is a theory of everything. There's a sort of social reproduction theory imperialism that goes on here, where people say this is also the framework for which we have to understand racism, or transphobia, or all these other aspects of the oppressions and exploitations we face under capitalism. And I think one of the problems with some of the literature is it neglects and ignores a couple of 100 years of profound Marxist analysis of things like racism. And we have to say we don't simply rely on social reproduction theory. Social reproduction theory is not the theory of everything. The theory of everything for us is Marxism. And therefore we have to integrate the other insights that come from the theories of racism going back to Marx himself. So there are limits to social reproduction theory, but I would really urge people to do what Sheila has done, read the stuff, take it seriously, engage with it, but engage with it in a critical way as Marxists.
Thank you. Based on the previous contribution, I would like to say that Lisa Vogel in her time had very good intentions, because it was the time of feminism, autonomist feminism, and this divorce from Marxism. And that's why I agree with the previous speaker that there are good arguments inside the book in trying to not underestimate women's oppression, but to take it seriously and combine it with Marx. The problem is that there are flaws, and when we try to use them today, the people who are trying to use them today, they don't use in my opinion, what was useful at that time, this connection with Marx and production, but the weakest parts. And what I want to say, when I read the Titi Bhattacharya's How Not to Skip Class, it starts saying, I want to show that women have a life after work. Thank you very much. Yeah, they do, and it's very important to take it very seriously that they have life after work. And it is the powerful thing that women are diverse and they come from different countries and different sexual orientations. But the problem is that the life after work is shaped by work. There are not different structures in society which anything can influence anything. We are for the theory of base and superstructure, and that's why it's not mechanical. It's capitalism which shapes the life after And so when we come to how to use this social reproduction theory today, it comes the opposite way than the intentions of Lisa Vogel. We come to women's strikes where men are not allowed to take part, or when they say that the most valuable thing is that we don't cook and we let the children in the house. While for us socialists, the thing is to take men to strike for women's issues, for the equality in wages and for provisions for health care and the kids, and we don't want neither of us to cook, and neither we are for a society which is going to provide care and food and cooking. We don't want to cook all the time. And the matter is not who is going to do all this stuff, but to inspire something else, and that's why it's not helpful today, despite any good intentions, but we have to come back to how to unite men and women to fight the women's oppression in the hard tasks we certainly face today with the cuts in social care.
Okay, I also come from Germany. So we have a debate on this question, as you notice. So I want to start with telling a short story about New Year's evening in Cologne in 2016. About several hundred young migrant workers, migrants, then in front of the dome, the cathedral, attacking women, young women. And in New Year's night they had drank alcohol and so on, and the racists took it up, and there was an attempt of the racists to use it, and I was shocked when I read the story the next morning. And that, what happened really was that groups of young women on the next day went on the platform of the dome and demonstrated against racism, and that you must not use this for racist reasons. And these were young women who were sort of came new to politics, and I think, thank God, we have not got the feminist of Alice Schwarzer anymore, because she is the main theoretician of feminism in Germany since the early 70s, and she sides with Pegida nowadays because she thinks Islam is oppressive against women. So this is a new start of a new women's movement, and I think some of them take up Lise Vogel. Why? Because they see a theory which unites oppression and exploitation in a unitary theory, as they pose it. There's a group of young students in Marx 21 who were under high pressure from, I would say, patriarchist theoreticians of women's question in the universities and in the SDS where they were. And they took up Lise Vogel's theory because they saw a weapon in this against the feminists and the patriarchal theory. And I think if I would start debating with them about the mistakes of Lise Vogel without stressing their strength, I would never reach their ear. And I think this was missing to me in your contribution, that because in your article, you start your article with the headline, Sheila, Lise Vogel a step forward or something, is it called, yeah? In your contribution today, you didn't do this. You just focus on the differences, and I think we should not do this.
A question, and then just a couple of announcements, and then I'll bring Sheila back in. I've got a question. It's in relation to racism, for example, veiled women in France are excluded from workplaces and schools. Do the something and women, SRT women,
and women's strikes.
And women's strikes, something women's rights to work. Sorry, I can't read your writing very well. Yeah. So
Can address the. Is this issue address women's right to work in the strikes?
Okay.
Is it useful?
So thank you to everybody who's contributed. Sorry, there's some people I just didn't manage to get in. Okay, I'll bring Sheila back in.
Right, I talked about, funnily enough, that revolutionary socialists have to avoid the Scylla and Charybdis, of accommodating to reformist ideas and tipping into sectarianism, and that actually has reflected itself in exactly in this debate. And I'll just quickly say, Folkert, I did make absolutely clear that social reproduction theory was a step forward. I located it in relation to intersectionality, which is actually how the social reproduction theorists themselves locate it, although I do agree with Judy that the question of patriarchy is still swimming around in the ether, but actually that's how they locate it. But I did actually make it very, very clear that it is a step forward because it actually puts the question of capitalism and class back at the centre of it and the nature of the working class today. So I'm sorry if you missed that and I didn't stress it enough. So I want to actually start, having said that, I want to start with the first contribution. I think one of the things which is hugely exciting for all of us over the last few years is the fact that, particularly with the election of Trump, we have seen a huge movement of, led by women in the United States, but over the question of Me Too, over the question of sexism, over the question of migrants, the women's strikes in the United States. Over here, we've had some important strikes that Jan was talking about. The school students and Extinction Rebellion, that whole notion that climate change is absolutely central to people's thinking now in British society, not just damn well Brexit, is hugely important. And the fact that the school students, through their strike action, have put at the centre of a debate on the left the question, can we rise to the level of the school students in terms of delivering strike action, is massively important. And of course all this debate about the nature of women's oppression and the question of social reproduction theory is part and parcel of that. And therefore I state absolutely unequivocally that just as we are part and parcel of those movements rising up against all forms of oppression and exploitation inside society, we are part of that. We also want to shape it because we know historically that in order to come to fruition, and it is being posed most starkly at the moment in Sudan with the level of struggle which has risen there, that actually when you reach the mass level of struggle that they have reached in Sudan, where you are confronting state power, then the question of where the power to counter that state power lies, the central question of the potential power of the working class and how you mobilise it, how you actually split the state, you split the army, what the alternative is to the capitalist state. All those questions come to the fore, and part and parcel of that, which is, I had other photos of the women workers and Algerian women who are actually central in the struggle in those two countries, necessarily also throw up the questions of sexism and throwing off the shackles of women's oppression and contesting the sexism, which of course is still there inside the movement, that at its sharpest, when the level of struggle rises, the question of state power, as I have said, and the centrality of the organisation of the working class, and whether there is revolutionary organisation which can actually use our traditions and historical experience, is actually whether that revolutionary influence is powerful enough and takes enough organised form to be able to contest the different kinds of reformist influences in order to be able to move forward to a successful revolution. That is an absolute central question for revolutionary socialists, and therefore when we are looking at the development of theory, it is one thing to say that it is a step forward, but at the same time, if it does not measure the task, we also have to explain why it does not measure the task. Because all those people who are coming new into movement and who actually want to fight need to have fully grounded analyses. And that's why I did talk about the weaknesses of Vogel. And funnily enough, I would prefer it if people did start with Marx's writings. I would prefer it if all the young activists started with the Communist Manifesto and then moved into the analysis of capital and didn't go via Vogel. Now, if people are going to go via Vogel, then let's try to take them into other analyses which are being developed by other people and take them back into a round of it. In other words, we are in a contest of ideas. And that's why I talked through some of the limitations of Vogel, but then the next part I talked about I think is hugely important, because what strikes me there is a quite, and people should not have illusions about this. People like David McNally and Susan Ferguson come out of a particular Marxist stream. They are not. This is not just accidental ideas in the ether. David McNally is the person who believes that different kinds of revolutionary formation of some sort or another should be developed. And John Molyneux talked yesterday about the whole question of one aspect of that being conferences of the left. I don't know how many people here have had the pleasure of going to historical materialism conferences. Now, they're important fora, but the idea that you get a clear analysis of what is happening in the world and a clear thread, the key link of how to move forward, you don't. That actually has to be fought for within it. Now, that is not the same, and I wish I had been able to go to the conference that Judy is talking about, precisely because what she is saying and what Folcott actually touched on is there are people who are being drawn to these ideas, and we actually have to welcome and be involved in those kinds of discussions and debates. And as I say, I'm sorry I missed it. But in the process of that, and I think that's where, it's what I tried to do in my article, and I actually quite like the way Joseph put it, using Vogel against the Vogelists. I do actually think we have to say Vogel did talk about the primacy of production over reproduction. Actually, Tita Bhattacharya blurs that question. And that's why I talked about, and this is really, and I'll finish on this, for me, we actually have to try to explain to people that the development of revolutionary theory as Marxist, and I agree with the sister who spoke about, there are all sorts of flaws and so on and so forth. I mean, nobody is saying go back to Marx's and Engels' writings and say, boom, it was all, absolutely, we have to develop it, right? Absolutely right about that. That in the process of the things that really clicked with me is this. For us, and this is all of my training, is Marxism is a guide to revolutionary action. Marx and Engels are revolutionaries. They developed the ideas. He wrote Capital to act as a guide for people to intervene in the class struggle in order to change the world. And therefore the measure for us always has to be, is the development of this set of ideas rooted in what we need now? And does it start from the totality of society and what is driving the emergence of these phenomena? Or is it one-sided? And my fear is, precisely because of the direction that people like Titi Bhattacharya have pushed it in, is that the addressing of all the issues, whether climate change, racism, migrants and so forth, is done from a one-sided perspective. And once you start from the one-sided perspective and it is not acting as a guide for action, that's what throws you off beam. And that's really, for me, one is the central questions about actually why there are limitations to social reproduction theory, but we actually have to be diving in there and swimming alongside people, and if you can when you swim, actually arguing with people about, like Joseph said at the end of his contribution, the superiority of Marxism. And the final point is the answer to your question. People who are involved in discussing social reproduction theory will have all sorts of kinds of attitudes to the question of the wearing of hijab. I think I can faithfully say that Titi Bhattacharya herself would have absolutely the right position, that it matters not a whit what you wear, and would defend absolutely the right of women to wear the hijab and be completely opposed to the laws in France and the rest of Europe. Oh, and by the way, If you're not a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, woo!